When we think about huge inventions, what comes to mind? The wheel, the printing press. How about paper money? It's one of those things that completely changed the world. But here's the crazy part. It wasn't just invented once. History shows us it happened twice, completely independently. It's this incredible story of parallel thinking. I mean, really think about it for a second. Why on earth would you trade a solid chunk of metal, something you can feel, something that's real, for a flimsy piece of paper? For literally thousands of years, money was metal. Gold, silver, copper. It had value in and of itself. So what was the trick? What convinced people to make that leap of faith? Well, the answer isn't some simple single event. It's a story. Actually, it's two stories that unfolded in two totally different parts of the world, hundreds and hundreds of years apart. We're talking about two completely different cultures who had no contact, somehow coming up with the exact same game-changing idea. So let's set the stage. Our two main players couldn't be more different. First, you've got 11th century Sichuan, a super busy, bustling province in Song Dynasty China. And then, way over in 17th century Sweden, a rising power in Europe. But here's the thing. They had the exact same headache. Their money was made of these heavy, low-value metals. And their solution? You guessed it, the world's first paper notes. Okay, so first things first, let's dig into the problem. This wasn't some genius in a lab thinking up a new theory of money. No way. This whole thing was born out of a really practical, really heavy problem that was making it almost impossible to do business. All right, picture this. You're a merchant in Sichuan, China, and you're stuck using these old iron coins from a past dynasty. Now, these coins are worth next to nothing, so if you want to buy, say, a big shipment of silk, you don't need a wallet, you need a wheelbarrow. I'm not kidding. You'd literally need a cart just to drag your cash around. For a booming economy, this was a total nightmare. Now, let's jump forward 600 years and thousands of miles away. Incredibly, Sweden has the same problem, but with a different metal. Their big export was copper, so to keep the price high, they made their money out of it. And I'm not talking about little coins. We're talking about massive copper plates. Some of these coins weighed over 40 pounds. 40 pounds! Can you imagine trying to buy a loaf of bread with a 40-pound metal slab? It's just ridiculous. So you've got these governments making money that's basically unusable. So who fixed it? You might think it was the governments, right? Nope. It was the people on the ground, the merchants, the entrepreneurs who were getting crushed by this system and just desperately needed a better way to trade. And what they came up with is something economists call fiduciary money. It sounds complicated, but the idea is actually pretty simple. The value isn't in the thing itself, the piece of paper. The value is in the trust. It's a shared belief that the person or the bank who gave you that paper will make good on their promise. It's basically a social contract printed on a little slip of paper. Now in China, this didn't just happen overnight. It was a gradual thing. It kind of started back in the Tang Dynasty with this thing called flying cash, which were basically just receipts you could get for your metal coins. But then in the Song Dynasty, the merchants in Sichuan really took it to the next level. They set up a system where you could drop off your back-breakingly heavy iron coins, and they'd give you these private notes called jiaozi. These were way, way easier to carry around and use for business. And here's where the parallel just gets amazing. Over in Sweden, a Dutch merchant, a guy named Johan Palmstruck, starts a private bank called Stockholms Banco. And in 1661, he does the exact same thing. He starts issuing paper notes, these creditive sedlar, in exchange for those giant clunky copper plates. And guess what? People went crazy for them. It was a massive hit. In fact, people loved the paper notes so much, they were willing to trade them for more than the value of the copper they were supposed to represent. That's how much they hated lugging that metal around. But you know how it goes. This private sector paradise of easy, lightweight money, well, it was too good to last. See, the thing that made paper notes so great, how easy they were to create, turned out to be their biggest flaw. And that flaw would lead to a crisis that forced the government to get involved. So let's look at how it fell apart in Sichuan. At first, the government tried a light touch, just some basic rules. But the temptation was just too much. These private merchants started printing way more notes than they had iron to back them up. And when people figured that out, trust just evaporated. The notes became worthless. The whole system crashed. And by 1023, the Song government had no choice but to step in and take over, creating the very first official state-backed paper money in history.
And it's just wild how the story in Sweden followed the exact same script. It's almost a carbon copy. That very human temptation, that desire to just create wealth out of thin air, it was too powerful. And just like in China, a brilliant private idea spiraled into a public disaster that the government had to clean up.
Poor Johann Palmstruck. He couldn't resist. He started printing more and more notes, way more than the copper he had stored away. Of course, word got out, and what happens when people lose trust in a bank? A bank run. Everyone stampeded to his bank, demanding their copper back. Stockholm's Banco collapsed. Palmstruck ended up in prison, and out of that mess, the Swedish government created the Riksbank, which, by the way, is the world's first ever central bank. Okay, so now the government is running the show in both China and Sweden. Everything's fixed now, right? Well, not so fast. Because that great temptation, the one to just print more money, it didn't go away. It just changed hands from private merchants to government officials. And this is where our two parallel stories start to go in very, very different directions.
It didn't take long for both governments to figure out that having control of the money supply was like a superpower. Need to pay for a war? Just print more money. The Song dynasty was always at war with invaders from the north. Sweden was tangled up in huge European conflicts, and in both cases, they did the same thing. They fired up the printing presses, flooded the market with cash, and surprise, surprise, the value of their money went right down the drain.
So this all leads to the big question. If you're going to have paper money, how do you keep people's trust in it? And this is where China and Europe came up with two totally different answers. In Song China, the thinking was, our notes are valuable because you'll always need them to pay your taxes to us. The money was backed by future tax revenue, especially from things the government controlled, like salt and tea. But in Europe, and specifically with the Bank of England, a new idea took hold: money backed by government debt. When you held a banknote, you were basically lending money to the government. It was an IOU from the state. This was a genius move because it meant that the wealthiest people now had a direct financial stake in making sure the government didn't collapse. And really, that's what this whole story boils down to. It doesn't matter if your money is a piece of metal, a promise of future taxes, or a share of national debt. At the end of the day, the real foundation of any money is just one thing: trust. It's the faith we have in the system that issues it. And hey, this isn't some new idea. Listen to this. A scholar from the Song dynasty, a guy named Yuan Shi, wrote this almost 900 years ago. He said paper notes will be worthless when there's a lot of them and valuable when they're rare. He nailed it. He understood the fundamental law of money way back then. It's all about scarcity and the trust that things will stay scarce. Which, of course, brings us right up to today. We're not talking about paper anymore, are we? We're talking about pixels on a screen, digital dollars, crypto, you name it. The technology is changing at lightning speed. But the big question is, has the fundamental lesson changed? Does this story from ancient China and old-timey Sweden still apply? Is the story of money, no matter what it looks like, still just a story about trust? That's something to think about.